The cold wind howled through the canyon as Nathaniel Lawson rode his exhausted mare along the banks of the Cimarron River, the sound of rushing water drowning out the painful memories that had followed him for the past 3 years. The year was 1878, and the New Mexico Territory was as unforgiving as it was beautiful, much like the life he'd chosen to lead after leaving everything behind in Missouri. Nathaniel pulled his worn leather hat lower against the setting sun, his weathered face etched with lines that made him appear older than his 32 years. The war had aged him, and the years since hadn't been any kinder. His mare, Penny, snorted with fatigue as he guided her toward the river's edge, planning to make camp before nightfall claimed the last of the daylight. That's when he heard it faint at first, almost lost in the rushing of the water. A cry. Weak but unmistakable. Nathaniel reined Penny to a halt, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver on his hip. He listened, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him after 18 hours in the saddle. Then he heard it again, the distinct wail of an infant. He dismounted quickly, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. Following the sound, he moved cautiously along the rocky shoreline, past a cluster of cottonwood trees, until he spotted something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, nestled against a boulder and partially hidden by river reeds, sat a woven basket. "What in God's name?" he muttered, approaching slowly. The crying grew louder as he neared. Nathaniel knelt beside the basket and pulled back a small, tattered blanket to reveal a baby, no more than a few months old, face red from crying, tiny fists waving in distress. "Easy there, little one," he whispered, his gruff voice softening instinctively. "Where did you come from?" As he lifted the child carefully from the basket, a folded piece of paper fell to the ground. Holding the baby awkwardly against his chest with one arm, Nathaniel retrieved the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the ink smudged in places by what appeared to be teardrops. "My dearest Jacob, if you are reading this, I am already gone. The consumption has taken what strength I had left, and I cannot bear to think of you following me to the grave. Your father never returned from the war, and I have no family left to care for you. I leave you by this river with my most fervent prayer that someone kind will find you before it's too late. Your name is Jacob. You were born on February 12th, 1878. Forgive me, my sweet boy. I had no choice. With eternal love, your mother." Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. He looked down at the infant, who had quieted somewhat against the warmth of his body. The baby Jacob gazed up at him with deep blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond his few months of life. "Your mama must have been desperate," Nathaniel said softly, tucking the note into his vest pocket. "But leaving you here? That's—" He couldn't finish the thought. The river was dangerous, rising with the spring melt. Coyotes roamed these banks at night. The baby could have died in countless ways before being found. The sun was nearly gone now, the canyon growing darker by the minute. Nathaniel knew he couldn't leave the child, but he also knew nothing about caring for a baby. The nearest town, Cedar Springs, was still a day's ride away. He had no milk, no proper food for an infant. "Well, Jacob," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue, "looks like we're in quite a predicament." The baby whimpered in response, his tiny body trembling. "You're cold, aren't you? Let's get you warmed up." Nathaniel gathered the basket and blanket, then led Penny farther from the river to a sheltered area beneath an overhanging rock. He quickly built a small fire, then fashioned a makeshift bed for the baby using his spare shirt and the blanket from the basket. As he worked, his mind raced. He would need to find milk for the child, and soon. He remembered passing a homestead about 5 miles back. Perhaps they would have a cow, or maybe a nursing mother who could spare some milk. It was his only option. "Hang on, little man," he told Jacob as he carefully placed him in the improvised bed. "I'm going to have to leave you here for a bit while I find you something to eat." The baby stared up at him, and Nathaniel felt an unexpected pang of responsibility. He had spent years avoiding attachments, wandering from town to town, taking odd jobs, and keeping to himself. Now, in the span of minutes, he was responsible for a human life. "I'll be back soon," he promised, checking to make sure the fire was safe and the baby was secure. "Don't you worry." With one last glance at Jacob, Nathaniel mounted Penny and rode back the way he had come, pushing his tired mare harder than he wanted to. The lives of both the baby and the horse were in his hands now, and he felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. The homestead appeared exactly as he remembered it, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral, smoke rising from the chimney against the now dark sky. Nathaniel approached cautiously. Strangers weren't always welcome in these parts, especially after nightfall. He dismounted at a respectable distance and called out, "Hello, the house. I mean no harm." After a moment, the door creaked open and a rifle barrel appeared, followed by a woman's voice. "State your business, stranger." "Name's Nathaniel Lawson, madam. I've found myself in an unusual situation and need some help, if you're willing." The door opened wider, revealing a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid. She kept the rifle trained on him. "What kind of help?" "I found a baby abandoned by the river. A note said his mother died of consumption. He needs milk, and I've got nothing to give him." The woman's expression changed, suspicion giving way to concern. "A baby? Where is it now?" "Left him at my camp, about 5 miles downriver. He's safe for the moment, but he's hungry." She studied him for a long moment, then lowered the rifle slightly. "You left a baby alone in the wilderness at night?" Nathaniel felt a flush of shame. "I didn't have much choice, madam. He needs food, and I couldn't bring him here not knowing if I'd find help." The woman sighed and set the rifle aside. "My name is Margaret Turner. I've got goat's milk that might do for now. Wait here." She disappeared into the house, returning moments later with a small glass bottle filled with milk and a clean cloth. "You know how to feed a baby?" Nathaniel shook his head. Never had cause to learn. Margaret hesitated, then set her jaw decisively. "I'll come with you. Let me gather a few things." "Madam, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. And it's not for you, it's for that baby." She turned back toward the house. "Give me 5 minutes." True to her word, Margaret emerged shortly with a small pack and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was a striking woman. Nathaniel realized now that he could see her properly in the lantern light she carried. Tall and slender, with a strength in her bearing that spoke of a life lived on her own terms. He guessed her to be in her mid-20s. "I've got my own horse," she said, heading toward the small barn. Nathaniel followed, curious. "You live out here alone, Miss Turner?" "Mrs. Turner," she corrected, though he noticed no ring on her finger. "My husband died 2 years ago. Fever took him." She led a sturdy paint horse from the barn, already saddled. "And yes, I manage on my own." He helped her mount, impressed by her self-sufficiency. "It's dangerous country for a woman alone." Margaret fixed him with a steady gaze. "No more dangerous than for an abandoned baby. Shall we go?" They rode in silence for a time, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Nathaniel found himself stealing glances at his companion, whose face remained set in a determined expression, illuminated by the pale moonlight. "How did you end up out here?" he finally asked. "My husband John and I came west from Pennsylvania in '73. He had dreams of raising horses." She gestured to the paint beneath her. "This is the last of his breeding stock. The rest I sold after he passed. I'm sorry." "Life happens as it will," she said simply. "And you? What brings a lone cowboy to these parts?" Nathaniel hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past. Just passing through, mostly. Worked some cattle drives up from Texas. Did some ranch work in Colorado. Nothing worth mentioning. Margaret seemed to sense his reluctance, and didn't press further. How old would you say this baby is? The note said he was born this February, so about 3 months, I reckon. And nothing else? No clue who the mother was? Nathaniel shook his head. Just that she was sick with consumption, and the father never returned from the war. Margaret frowned. The war's been over for 13 years. If the father fought in it, he's been gone a long while. The implications settled between them as they continued toward Nathaniel's camp. When they finally arrived, Jacob was awake and crying, his little face scrunched in distress. The fire had burned low but was still giving off enough light to see by. Margaret dismounted quickly and hurried to the makeshift bed. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, scooping the baby up with practiced ease. She glanced at Nathaniel as he tended the fire. "Build that up. We need more light and warmth." He did as instructed, watching as she expertly cradled Jacob and prepared the bottle. She dipped the cloth into the milk, then let the baby suck the liquid from it. "Not ideal," she explained, "but it will do until we can get him to town. He's hungry, but not starving." "Someone fed him recently." Nathaniel nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and renewed concern. His mother must have left him today, then. "It would seem so," Margaret agreed. "Poor woman must have been at the end of her strength." She looked up at Nathaniel. "What do you plan to do with him?" He hadn't thought that far ahead. "Take him to Cedar Springs, I suppose. Maybe the sheriff can find someone to take him in." Margaret continued feeding Jacob, who had calmed considerably. A lot of orphans these days. War widows who can't manage consumption victims. Not everyone has family to fall back on. "You think they'll just put him in an orphanage?" The thought bothered Nathaniel more than he expected. "Likely," she said. "Unless someone wants to adopt him." They fell silent, the weight of Jacob's uncertain future hanging between them. Eventually, the baby drifted to sleep in Margaret's arms, his tiny hand clutching her finger. "You're good with him," Nathaniel observed. A shadow crossed her face. "I had a son. He died the same fever that took John." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said again, feeling inadequate. "Like I said, life happens as it will." She gently placed Jacob back in his makeshift bed. "We should try to get some rest. We've got a long ride to Cedar Springs tomorrow." Nathaniel nodded, watching as she settled herself on the opposite side of the fire, using her pack as a pillow. He spread his bedroll nearby, close enough to be proper but far enough to maintain respectful distance. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have known what to do." Margaret turned toward him, her face half illuminated by the firelight. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," he replied. "Not anyone." She held his gaze for a moment, then turned away. "Good night, Mr. Lawson." "Nathaniel, please." A pause, then. "Good night, Nathaniel." "Good night, Mrs. Turner." "Margaret," she corrected softly. "If we're going to be traveling companions, we might as well use our given names." Nathaniel smiled to himself as he settled onto his bedroll. "Good night, Margaret." The night passed peacefully, with Jacob waking only twice for feeding. Each time, Margaret attended to him with quiet efficiency, while Nathaniel stoked the fire and kept watch. By dawn, they were ready to continue their journey to Cedar Springs. As they packed up camp, Nathaniel noticed Margaret examining the basket and the note he had found with Jacob. "It's heartbreaking," she said, tracing the tear-stained words with her finger. "To be so desperate that leaving your child by a river seems like the best option." Nathaniel nodded solemnly. "Desperation makes people do things they'd never imagine." Margaret looked at him sharply, as if hearing something significant in his words. "Yes, it does." They fashioned a sling for Jacob using Margaret's shawl, securing him against her chest for the ride. Nathaniel found himself impressed again by her practical approach to the situation. "You said Cedar Springs is a day's ride?" she asked as they mounted their horses. "Should reach it by nightfall if we keep a steady pace," he confirmed. "You know the town?" I've been there for supplies. It's small, but there's a doctor. Jacob should be examined. They set off at an easy trot, mindful of the precious cargo Margaret carried. The day warmed quickly, the spring sun climbing high in a cloudless sky. They stopped periodically to rest the horses and tend to Jacob, who seemed content in Margaret's care. During one such stop, as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, Margaret asked, "Where were you headed before finding Jacob?" Nathaniel shrugged. "Nowhere in particular. I heard there might be work at the Henderson Ranch near Fort Sumner." "That's a long way from Cedar Springs. Distance doesn't much matter when you've got no place specific to be." Margaret studied him while adjusting Jacob's position in her arms. "You strike me as a man running from something, Nathaniel Lawson." He tensed. "What makes you say that?" "Experience," she said simply. "I recognize the look. I've seen it in my own mirror." Before he could respond, Jacob began to fuss, and Margaret turned her attention to the baby. Nathaniel was grateful for the interruption. He wasn't ready to share the ghosts that haunted him, not even with this forthright woman who seemed to see more than most. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they approached more settled territory. By late afternoon, they could see smoke from chimneys rising in the distance. "Cedar Springs," Nathaniel confirmed. "We'll be there within the hour." Margaret nodded, but there was a hint of hesitation in her expression. "What happens when we get there?" It was a question Nathaniel had been pondering all day. "We'll find the sheriff first, explain the situation. Then maybe the doctor, like you suggested. And then," he glanced at her, "then I suppose we go our separate ways." Margaret looked down at Jacob, sleeping peacefully against her chest. "It doesn't seem right, just handing him over and leaving." "What else can we do?" Nathaniel asked, though he shared her reluctance. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was soft but determined. "I don't know yet, but I'm not simply going to drop him off like a parcel and be on my way." They rode into Cedar Springs just as the sun was beginning to set. The town was indeed small, a single main street lined with the essential businesses, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other establishments. People glanced curiously at them as they passed, their attention drawn to the baby Margaret carried. They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, a small building with a wooden sign and a single barred window. Nathaniel tied their horses to the hitching post and offered Margaret a hand as she dismounted carefully, mindful of Jacob. "Let me do the talking," he suggested as they approached the door. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm a woman?" "Because I found him," Nathaniel clarified. "And because sheriffs tend to be suspicious by nature." Inside, they found a middle-aged man with a graying mustache sitting behind a desk, reading a newspaper. He looked up as they entered, his eyes quickly taking in the unusual trio. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, setting aside his paper. "Sheriff, my name is Nathaniel Lawson. This is Mrs. Margaret Turner. Yesterday evening, I found this baby abandoned by the Cimarron River." Nathaniel reached into his vest pocket and produced the note. This was with him. The sheriff took the note and read it carefully, his expression growing grave. "You found him just like that? In a basket by the river?" "Yes, sir. Mrs. Turner was kind enough to help me get him here safely." The sheriff, who had introduced himself as Sheriff Daniels, looked at Margaret and the baby. "You two aren't together?" "No," Margaret replied. "Mr. Lawson came to my homestead seeking help for the baby. I provided goat's milk and accompanied him here." Sheriff Daniels leaned back in his chair, considering. "Well, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I'm not sure what you expect me to do. We don't have an orphanage in Cedar Springs. The baby needs to be examined by a doctor," Margaret said firmly. "And then we need to figure out what's best for him." "Doc Wilson's office is just down the street," the sheriff said. "As for what's best for the child," he sighed, There's an orphan train coming through in 2 weeks. Children get placed with families looking for help on their farms or in their businesses. Nathaniel saw Margaret stiffen. You mean as labor? As adopted children, the sheriff corrected, though without much conviction. It's better than an orphanage in the city. We'll take him to the doctor first, Nathaniel said, sensing Margaret's rising indignation. Then we can discuss the other options. Outside, Margaret was visibly upset. Orphan trains, she muttered. Shipping children off to strangers who want free labor. Nathaniel had heard of the practice but had never given it much thought before. Sometimes the families are good people, he offered. And sometimes they're not, she countered. Jacob deserves better than to be handed off to the first farmer who thinks he might be useful in a few years. They walked in silence to the doctor's office. Dr. Wilson, a kindly older gentleman with spectacles, examined Jacob thoroughly while listening to their story. The child appears healthy, if a bit underweight, he concluded. His mother must have cared for him as best she could, despite her illness. He looked at Margaret. You've been feeding him goat's milk? Yes, doctor. It was all I had available. It's adequate for now, but he'll need something more substantial as he grows. There are formulas that can be prepared. I can write down the instructions for whoever takes him in. The unresolved question of Jacob's future hung in the air. Is there a family in town who might be willing to adopt him? Nathaniel asked. Dr. Wilson considered.
Possibly.
The Hendersons lost their baby last winter. They might be open to taking in another, though the wound is still fresh.
He paused.
Of course, there's always the orphan train, as Sheriff Daniels likely mentioned. Margaret's expression darkened again. And, in the meantime, where does he stay tonight? The doctor glanced between them. I assumed one of you would be caring for him until arrangements are made. Nathaniel and Margaret exchanged looks. Neither had planned to stay in Cedar Springs beyond delivering Jacob to the proper authorities who, it seemed, were less prepared to handle the situation than they had hoped. The hotel has rooms available, Dr. Wilson suggested. You could stay there tonight and speak with the Hendersons tomorrow. Outside the doctor's office, the full weight of their predicament settled on them. Night had fallen completely now, and Cedar Springs had grown quiet, most of its residents already home for the evening. I can take him tonight, Margaret offered, adjusting Jacob in her arms. He's used to me now. Nathaniel nodded, grateful but uncertain. I'll pay for your room at the hotel. That's not necessary. Please, he insisted. It's the least I can do. You've already done far more than I had any right to ask. She relented, and they walked to the small hotel at the end of the main street. The proprietor, a plump woman named Mrs. Ellison, was openly curious about their situation but provided a clean room with a small crib that her own children had once used. Will you be needing one room or two? She asked, eyes moving between them with undisguised interest. Two, they answered in unison. Mrs. Ellison seemed disappointed by this straightforward arrangement, but showed them to adjacent rooms on the second floor. Nathaniel's was sparse but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small window overlooking the main street. Margaret's was similar, with the addition of the promised crib. I'll bring up some hot water for washing, Mrs. Ellison offered. And I have some clean cloths that might serve as diapers for the little one. Thank you, Margaret said warmly. That's very kind. After the proprietor left, Nathaniel lingered awkwardly in the doorway of Margaret's room. Will you be all right? With Jacob, I mean. She smiled tiredly. We'll manage. It's not my first night with a baby. Nathaniel nodded, remembering her lost son. If you need anything during the night, I'll call, she assured him. Good night, Nathaniel. Good night, Margaret. He returned to his own room, suddenly exhausted. The events of the past 24 hours felt surreal, finding Jacob, meeting Margaret, traveling to Cedar Springs. None of it had been in his plans, yet here he was, involved in the fate of an orphaned baby and increasingly drawn to a widow he had known for barely a day. Nathaniel removed his boots and hat, then stretched out on the bed without bothering to undress further. His mind raced with thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. Would the Hendersons want Jacob? Should he care either way? His original destination, the ranch near Fort Sumner, seemed increasingly distant and unimportant. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of the hotel and his own troubled thoughts. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, he heard Jacob crying through the wall, followed by the gentle murmur of Margaret's voice. The crying stopped, and Nathaniel found himself smiling in the darkness before drifting back to sleep. Morning arrived with bright sunlight streaming through the small window. Nathaniel washed and dressed quickly, eager to check on Margaret and Jacob. He found them already downstairs in the hotel's small dining room, Margaret looking remarkably put together despite what he assumed had been a night of interrupted sleep. "Good morning," he greeted, taking the chair opposite her. Jacob was cradled in one arm while she attempted to eat with the other. "Good morning," she replied. "We've been up for hours, haven't we, Jacob?" The baby gurgled in response, his blue eyes bright and alert. "How did he sleep?" "Better than I expected. Mrs. Ellison found some clean cloths for diapers and helped me prepare a proper bottle." She nodded toward the proprietor, who was watching them with undisguised interest from behind the counter. "She seems very helpful," Nathaniel observed dryly. Margaret smiled. "She's also very curious. I've fielded at least a dozen questions about our situation this morning." "What did you tell her?" "The truth that we found an abandoned baby and brought him to town, hoping to find him a good home." Nathaniel nodded, grateful for her straightforward approach. "Dr. Wilson mentioned the Hendersons. Do you think we should call on them today?" Margaret's expression grew serious. "I've been thinking about that. What if they don't want him? Or what if they do, but they're not?" She trailed off. "Not what?" "Not right for him," she finished. "How can we know if they'll be good parents? How can we hand him over to strangers when we know nothing about them?" Nathaniel considered her words. She was right, they had no way of knowing whether the Hendersons or any other family in town would provide a loving home for Jacob. Yet what was the alternative? They couldn't keep carrying him around indefinitely. "What do you suggest?" he asked finally. Margaret looked down at Jacob, who had fallen asleep against her chest. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can't bear the thought of leaving him with people we know nothing about, or worse, putting him on that orphan train." Before Nathaniel could respond, the door to the dining room opened and Sheriff Daniels entered. He spotted them immediately and approached their table. "Mr. Lawson, Mrs. Turner," he greeted with a nod. "I've spoken with the Hendersons. They're willing to meet the baby this afternoon if that suits you." Margaret exchanged a glance with Nathaniel. "That's very kind of them," she said carefully. "Could you tell us a bit about them first?" The sheriff seemed surprised by the question. "Good folks. Thomas Henderson runs the mercantile. His wife, Sarah, stays home. They lost their firstborn to fever a few months back." He looked uncomfortably at Jacob. "They've been hoping for another child. We'll meet with them," Nathaniel decided, seeing the conflicted emotions on Margaret's face. "What time would be convenient?" 2 o'clock, at their home behind the mercantile," the sheriff replied. "I'll let them know to expect you." After he left, Margaret remained silent, her eyes fixed on Jacob's sleeping face. "We're just meeting them," Nathaniel reminded her gently. "No decisions have to be made today." She nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. "I know. It's just. It feels like his whole future is being decided so quickly by people who didn't even know he existed 2 days ago." Nathaniel reached across the table and covered her hand with his, surprising them both with the gesture. "We'll make sure he's going to a good home, Margaret. I promise." She turned her hand to grasp his, a silent acknowledgement of their shared concern for the baby who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. In that moment, Something shifted between them, a recognition that they were no longer simply two strangers thrown together by circumstance, but partners in a responsibility neither had sought, but both now felt deeply. The morning passed quietly. They took turns holding Jacob while the other ate breakfast, then ventured out onto the main street to purchase a few necessities: better cloths for diapers, a small blanket, and milk from the general store. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles, watched them with interest as they made their selections. "You folks new in town?" he asked as he wrapped their purchases. "Just passing through," Nathaniel replied. "We found this little one abandoned and brought him to town." The man's eyebrows rose. "Found him, you say? Where?" "By the Cimarron River," Margaret answered, adjusting Jacob in her arms. His mother left a note saying she was dying of consumption. "Well, now, that's a sad tale," the shopkeeper said, shaking his head. "What will become of him?" "We're meeting with the Hendersons this afternoon," Nathaniel said, noting how Margaret tensed at the mention. The shopkeeper nodded approvingly. "Good folks, the Hendersons. Been through a terrible time since losing their boy. This might be a blessing for all concerned." As they left the store, Margaret was quiet, her brow furrowed in thought. "What is it?" Nathaniel asked as they walked slowly back toward the hotel. "Everyone says they're good people," she said. "I should be relieved, but you're not." She sighed. "Is it selfish of me to feel this way? To be so reluctant to let him go?" Nathaniel considered her question carefully. "I don't think it's selfish to care about what happens to him. You've been looking after him, feeding him. It's natural to feel attached. And you?" she asked, looking up at him. "How do you feel about all this?" It was a question he had been avoiding. From the moment he'd found Jacob by the river, he had tried to maintain a practical detachment, focusing on immediate needs rather than emotions. But the truth was, he did feel something, a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. "I want what's best for him," he said finally. "Whatever that turns out to be." Margaret seemed to accept this answer, though he suspected she sensed the depth of feeling he wasn't expressing. They returned to the hotel to rest and prepare for their meeting with the Hendersons. At precisely 2 o'clock, they stood before a modest two-story house behind the mercantile. It was well maintained, with a small garden out front and curtains in the windows, the home of people who had put down roots and expected to stay. Thomas Henderson answered their knock. He was a robust man in his 30s with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. "Mr. Lawson, Mrs. Turner." He greeted them, having obviously been informed of their names. "Please come in. Sarah is eager to meet you and the baby." The interior of the house was comfortable and clean, with simple but quality furnishings. Sarah Henderson waited in the parlor, a slender woman with blonde hair pulled back in a bun. Her face bore the subtle marks of recent grief, a sadness around the eyes, a tension in her smile that suggested it was not as natural as it once had been. "Welcome," she said, rising from her chair. Her gaze immediately went to Jacob, who was awake and alert in Margaret's arms. "Oh, he's beautiful." "This is Jacob," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the emotion Nathaniel could see in her eyes. "He's about 3 months old, according to the note his mother left." Sarah approached cautiously, as if afraid the baby might disappear if she moved too quickly. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. Margaret hesitated only briefly before carefully transferring Jacob to Sarah's waiting embrace. The woman cradled him with practiced ease, tears welling in her eyes as she looked down at his face. "Hello, Jacob," she whispered. "Aren't you a handsome little man?" Thomas Henderson watched his wife with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "We lost our William 3 months ago," he explained quietly to Nathaniel. "He was only 6 months old. Sarah hasn't been the same since." Nathaniel nodded, understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss. When Sheriff Daniels told us about the baby you found, well, it seemed like Providence." They sat in the parlor, watching as Sarah gently rocked Jacob and spoke to him in soft tones. Margaret remained tense beside Nathaniel, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Sheriff Daniels explained how you found him," Thomas said. "It's a miracle you came along when you did." "Yes," Nathaniel agreed. The river was rising, and night was coming on. He wouldn't have survived much longer. "His mother must have been desperate," Sarah said, looking up from Jacob. "To leave him like that." "The note said she was dying of consumption," Margaret explained. "And that his father never returned from the war." Sarah nodded sadly. "So many children left without parents. It breaks my heart." She returned her attention to Jacob, who had begun to fuss. "Is he hungry? What have you been feeding him?" "Goat's milk," Margaret replied. "Dr. Wilson examined him yesterday and said he's healthy, just a bit underweight." "I have a bottle prepared," Sarah said, an eagerness in her voice that bordered on desperation. "May I feed him?" Margaret nodded, though Nathaniel could see the struggle on her face. They watched as Sarah expertly fed Jacob, who took to the bottle eagerly. "You seem very comfortable with him," Nathaniel observed. "Sarah was born to be a mother," Thomas said proudly. "William was the answer to our prayers, and losing him—" He paused, emotion overcoming him momentarily. "It's been difficult. We understand this is a big decision," Nathaniel said carefully. "For all of us. Jacob needs a loving home, and you both have suffered a great loss." Thomas nodded. "We've discussed it. If you're agreeable, we would like to take Jacob in to adopt him as our own. We have the means to provide for him, and our hearts are ready to love another child." Margaret drew a sharp breath beside Nathaniel. He placed a steadying hand on her arm, feeling the tension in her body. "That's very generous," she managed. "But we've only just met. How can we be sure that we'll be good parents?" Sarah finished, looking up from Jacob with understanding in her eyes. "You're right to be cautious, Mrs. Turner. You've been caring for him, and you want to be certain he's going to a loving home." "Yes," Margaret admitted. "Exactly." "Perhaps we could take some time," Thomas suggested. "A few days for you to get to know us better, to see our home, our life. Would that help?" Nathaniel felt Margaret relax slightly beside him. "That seems reasonable," he agreed. "We're not in any rush to leave town." The tension in the room eased somewhat with this compromise. They spent another hour with the Hendersons, learning more about their life in Cedar Springs and their hopes for the future. Sarah reluctantly returned Jacob to Margaret when it was time for them to leave, but not before extracting a promise that they would bring him back the following day. As they walked back to the hotel, Jacob sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms, Nathaniel studied her profile in the late afternoon light. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "They seem kind," she admitted. "And they clearly want a child to love. But," she sighed, "but I can't shake this feeling. This attachment to Jacob. It's foolish, I know. I've only known him for a day." "It's not foolish," Nathaniel assured her. "You've been caring for him. That creates a bond." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "What about you, Nathaniel? You found him. You saved his life. Don't you feel anything when you think about leaving him with strangers?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. He had been so focused on practical matters, finding food for Jacob, bringing him to town, finding him a home, that he had scarcely allowed himself to examine his own feelings. "I do," he admitted finally. "More than I expected to." They continued walking in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the hotel, Mrs. Ellison informed them that she had prepared a bath for Jacob and found some clean baby clothes that her grandchildren had outgrown. "News travels fast in a small town," Margaret remarked as they climbed the stairs to their rooms. "Especially news involving foundling babies and mysterious strangers," Nathaniel agreed with a wry smile. In Margaret's room, they worked together to bathe Jacob, a process that proved more challenging than anticipated. The baby squirmed and protested, then seemed to delight in splashing water everywhere. By the time they had him clean, dried, and dressed in the borrowed clothes, both Nathaniel and Margaret were damp and laughing. "I never imagined bathing such a small person could be so complicated," Nathaniel said, wiping water from his face. "He's strong-willed," Margaret observed, smiling down at Jacob, who was now contentedly gumming his fist. "That will serve him well in life." Nathaniel watched her with the baby, struck by how natural she seemed with him. "You're good with children." A shadow crossed her face. "I had practice. My son, James, was just learning to walk when the fever took him." "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said, wishing he could offer more than words. "How old would he be now?" "4," she replied softly. "He'd be 4 years old." Nathaniel hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Margaret, why are you living alone on that homestead? Surely after losing your husband and son, you could have returned to family?" She was quiet for a long moment, gently rocking Jacob. "My family didn't approve of John. They cut ties when we married. And his family. They're all back east. I couldn't bear to leave the land he loved so much, the place where James is buried." She looked up at Nathaniel. "The homestead is all I have left of them." He nodded, understanding better now her fierce independence and the depth of her loss. "And yet you left it to help a stranger with an abandoned baby." A small smile touched her lips. "Some things are more important than holding on to the past, I suppose." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Ellison had brought up their dinner on a tray, along with fresh milk for Jacob's evening feeding. "Thought you might prefer to eat up here," she explained, setting the tray on a small table. "More private-like." "Thank you, Mrs. Ellison," Margaret said. "You've been very kind." "Think nothing of it, dear. That little one is the most exciting thing to happen in Cedar Springs in months. Half the town is talking about him, and about you too, of course." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "About us?" Mrs. Ellison looked mildly embarrassed. "Well, naturally people are curious. A handsome cowboy and a pretty widow show up with a baby? Tongues are bound to wag." After she left, Nathaniel and Margaret exchanged amused glances. "Apparently, we're the subject of town gossip," he said, serving her a plate from the tray. "I can only imagine what they're saying," Margaret replied, settling Jacob in the center of the bed, surrounded by pillows to prevent him from rolling. They ate together in comfortable silence, the events of the day catching up with them. Jacob dozed between feedings, seemingly content in their care. As evening deepened into night, Nathaniel found himself reluctant to return to his own room. There was something peaceful about sitting with Margaret and Jacob, something that felt surprisingly right. "I should let you get some rest," he finally said, rising from his chair. "Tomorrow will be another full day." Margaret nodded, though he thought he detected a similar reluctance in her eyes. "Good night, Nathaniel. And thank you for everything." "Thank you," he countered. "I wouldn't have known what to do without your help." He returned to his room, but sleep eluded him. His mind kept returning to Margaret, her strength, her kindness, the way her eyes softened when she looked at Jacob, and to the baby, who had entered their lives so unexpectedly and changed everything in ways Nathaniel was only beginning to understand. The next few days fell into a pattern. They would spend mornings with Jacob at the hotel, then afternoons with the Hendersons. Sarah and Thomas were patient and kind, clearly eager to welcome Jacob into their home, but respectful of Margaret and Nathaniel's need to be certain he would be well cared for. On the third day, as they walked back to the hotel after another visit, Margaret broke their companionable silence. "They love him already. You can see it in their eyes." Nathaniel nodded. "They seem like good people. Stable, kind." "They would give him a good life," she agreed, her voice strained despite the words. He stopped walking and turned to face her. "But..." Margaret looked down at Jacob, sleeping against her shoulder. But I can't bear the thought of leaving him, Nathaniel. It's madness, I know. I have no right to feel this way. I'm a widow living alone on a struggling homestead. What could I possibly offer him? A mother's love, Nathaniel said quietly. That's no small thing. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What are you saying? He took a deep breath, scarcely believing what he was about to suggest. What if he didn't have to do it alone? What if? What if we raised him together? Margaret stared at him, clearly stunned. Nathaniel, we barely know each other. I know, he acknowledged, and I know how it sounds. But these past few days, I've felt more purpose, more connection than I have in years. Maybe finding Jacob wasn't just about saving him. Maybe it was about saving us too. Us, she repeated. I've been running for a long time, Margaret. From memories, from responsibility, from anything that might tie me down. But when I found Jacob, something changed. And when I met you... He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. I stopped wanting to run. Margaret shook her head slowly, but there was a softness in her expression that gave him hope. This is madness, she whispered. What are you proposing exactly? I'm proposing that we give Jacob a family, a mother, and a father who chose him, who want him. I'm proposing that we build something together, the three of us. You're talking about marriage, she said, her voice barely audible. Yes, he admitted. I am. They stood in the middle of the street, the setting sun painting the buildings around them in gold and amber. Jacob slept on, oblivious to the life-changing conversation happening above him. You don't love me, Margaret said finally. And I don't love you. Not yet. No, Nathaniel agreed. But I respect you. I admire your strength, your kindness, your determination. I think we could build a good life together if you're willing to try. And what of your wandering ways? Would you really be content to settle down on my homestead? He considered her question seriously. I think so. I've been running long enough. Maybe it's time to stand still, to build something that lasts. Margaret studied his face, searching for something sincerity, perhaps, or certainty. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. I need time to think, she said finally. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Of course, he agreed. Take all the time you need. They continued their walk back to the hotel in silence, the weight of his proposal hanging between them. That evening, they ate dinner separately, Nathaniel giving Margaret the space she had requested. He spent a restless night wondering if he had overstepped, if he had ruined the fragile connection they had formed. Morning came with a knock on his door. He opened it to find Margaret standing there, Jacob in her arms, her expression resolute. I've been thinking about your proposal, she said without preamble. Nathaniel's heart raced. And it's unconventional, possibly foolish. People will talk. People always talk, he said, a small smile playing at his lips. We would need to be clear about expectations. I won't be a convenient wife, there to cook your meals and wash your clothes while you come and go as you please. I wouldn't want that, he assured her. I'm proposing a partnership, Margaret. Equal in all things. She nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. Then yes, Nathaniel Lawson. I accept your proposal. For Jacob's sake and, perhaps, for our own as well. Relief and joy washed over him. He stepped forward and took her free hand in his. Thank you, he said simply. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. We should tell the Hendersons. They deserve to know as soon as possible. The Hendersons received the news with mixed emotions, disappointment over losing Jacob, but genuine happiness for the unconventional family that was forming. You'll make wonderful parents, Sarah said, tears in her eyes as she held Jacob one last time. He's a lucky boy to be so loved. They were married the following day in a simple ceremony at the small church in Cedar Springs. The minister was initially hesitant about the hasty wedding until Sheriff Daniels vouched for their character and explained the circumstances. Margaret wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Nathaniel, having visited the barber that morning, looked more respectable than he had in years. Jacob, dressed in clothes gifted by the Hendersons, was held by Mrs. Ellison during the brief ceremony. The hotel proprietor had appointed herself unofficial godmother to the baby and witness to the wedding, her initial curiosity having transformed into genuine affection for the unusual family. After the ceremony, they shared a meal at the hotel with their small group of new friends, then prepared to depart for Margaret's homestead the following morning. "Are you sure about this?" Nathaniel asked Margaret as they stood in her hotel room that evening, Jacob already asleep in his crib. It was the first time they had been alone since becoming husband and wife, and a new awkwardness had settled between them. "About marrying you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flush in her cheeks. "Yes, I'm sure. About what comes next? That remains to be seen." Nathaniel nodded, understanding her mix of certainty and apprehension. "We'll take it one day at a time," he promised. "No expectations beyond what feels right." She smiled gratefully. "Thank you for understanding." That night, Nathaniel slept on the floor of Margaret's room, near enough to help with Jacob if needed, but maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the unusual nature of their union. Marriage had not instantly transformed them into lovers. That would come with time, if it was meant to be. The journey back to Margaret's homestead took most of the following day. They traveled slowly, mindful of Jacob's comfort, stopping frequently to feed and change him. Nathaniel found himself increasingly impressed by Margaret's practical approach to motherhood and her resilience in the face of challenges. As they crested the final hill and Margaret's homestead came into view, Nathaniel felt a surprising sense of homecoming. The modest cabin, small barn, and surrounding fields represented something he had never truly had a place to belong. "It's not much," Margaret said, watching his face. "But it's sturdy and warm." "It's perfect," he assured her. They settled into a routine over the next few weeks. Nathaniel repaired fences, tended to the animals, and began preparing the fields for planting. Margaret cared for Jacob and maintained the household, while also tending her vegetable garden and helping with the livestock when she could. Each night, they would sit on the porch after Jacob was asleep, talking about their day and gradually sharing more of their pasts. Nathaniel told her about his time in the war, the friends he had lost, and the restlessness that had driven him westward afterward. Margaret spoke of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her courtship with John, and the devastating losses that had shaped her life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their relationship deepened. A casual touch while passing dishes at dinner. A shared laugh over Jacob's antics. A lingering glance across the room. The walls between them were coming down, brick by careful brick. One evening, about a month after their return to the homestead, Nathaniel found Margaret standing by Jacob's cradle, watching him sleep. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "He's growing so fast," she whispered, a smile in her voice. "I swear he's heavier every time I pick him up." "He's thriving," Nathaniel agreed. "You're a wonderful mother, Margaret." She turned to look at him, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "And you're becoming a fine father. I see how you look at him, how gentle you are with him." "I never thought I'd have a family," he admitted. "After the war, I couldn't imagine settling down, being responsible for anyone but myself. And now I can't imagine going back to that life. You and Jacob. You've given me something I didn't know I was missing." Margaret's hand found his in the dim light. "You've given us something too, Nathaniel. Security, yes, but more than that. Hope. A future." He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face. "Margaret, I want you to know that I'm happy with how things are between us." "I don't expect," she silenced him by placing a finger against his lips. "I know, but what if I want more?" The question hung between them, charged with possibility. Nathaniel searched her eyes, finding warmth and invitation there. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Margaret stepped closer and lifted her face to his. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the beginning of something, not its culmination. When they separated, both were smiling. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Nathaniel Lawson," Margaret whispered, against all odds and common sense. He chuckled softly. "There's nothing sensible about any of this. Finding a baby by a river, marrying a woman I'd known for days, becoming a father overnight. And yet here we are," she said, her arms encircling his waist. "Here we are," he agreed, holding her close. "And I wouldn't change a thing." That night, Margaret invited Nathaniel to share her bed not just as her husband in name, but as her partner in every sense. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a physical expression of the bond that had been growing between them since the day they met. Afterward, as Margaret slept beside him, Nathaniel reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a drifter with no attachments and no direction. Now he was a husband, a father, a man with roots and responsibilities. The thought, which would once have terrified him, now filled him with contentment. Life on the homestead settled into a rhythm as spring gave way to summer. Jacob grew stronger each day, his personality emerging curious, determined, quick to smile. He began to recognize Nathaniel and Margaret, reaching for them when they came near, crying when they left his sight. Word of their unusual situation had spread through the nearby communities, and occasionally visitors would stop by, ostensibly to trade or seek directions, but really to catch a glimpse of the family that had formed under such extraordinary circumstances. Margaret handled these intrusions with grace, neither hiding their story nor elaborating beyond what was necessary. "People will always be curious," she told Nathaniel after one such visit. "But in time, they'll find something else to talk about, and we'll just be another family trying to make our way in the world." As summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the landscape, Nathaniel realized that the restlessness that had driven him for so long had faded. He no longer felt the pull of the horizon, the need to keep moving to outrun his memories. Instead, he found himself planning for the future, considering which crops to plant next season, thinking about expanding the small herd of goats, even contemplating building an addition to the cabin as Jacob grew. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob asleep in Nathaniel's arms, Margaret brought up something that had been on her mind. "I've been thinking about Jacob's mother," she said quietly. "About her final act of love, leaving him where he might be found." Nathaniel nodded, remembering the tear-stained note that had broken his heart that day by the river. "She must have been desperate. Do you still have the note?" Margaret asked. "I'd like to keep it for Jacob so that when he's older, he can know that his birth mother loved him enough to give him his best chance." Nathaniel reached into his pocket and produced the folded paper, now worn at the creases from being carried daily. "I've kept it with me," he admitted, "a reminder of how our family began." Margaret took it carefully, her fingers tracing the faded words. "Sometimes I wonder if she's watching from somewhere, if she knows that her son is safe and loved." "I hope so," Nathaniel said softly, looking down at the sleeping child in his arms. "I hope she found peace knowing she did the right thing." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. "I love you," Nathaniel said simply, the words coming naturally after months of growing closer. Margaret smiled up at him. "And I love you, both of you," she added, gently touching Jacob's cheek. As the years passed, their family flourished. The homestead grew more prosperous under their joint care, with Nathaniel's strength and farming knowledge complementing Margaret's practical skills and determination. Jacob grew into a sturdy, inquisitive boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's compassionate heart. When Jacob was 3, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, cementing the bond between them and creating a sibling relationship that would last a lifetime. 2 years later, another son joined their family, completing their circle. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Nathaniel and Margaret would sit on the porch and marvel at the journey that had brought them together, a desperate mother's final act of love, a cowboy's chance discovery by a river, and a widow's courage to open her heart again. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't ridden by the river that day? Margaret would ask. And Nathaniel would always answer the same way. I don't believe in coincidences, not anymore. I was meant to find Jacob, just as I was meant to find you. On Jacob's 10th birthday, they gave him the note his birth mother had left, carefully preserved all those years. He read it solemnly, tears in his eyes, then looked up at the only parents he had ever known. She loved me, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Yes, Margaret confirmed, holding him close. She loved you enough to make the hardest choice a mother can make. And we love you enough to make sure you always remember her. We all have different journeys, Nathaniel added, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, those journeys bring us exactly where we're meant to be. As he looked at his family, Margaret, now truly his partner in all things, Jacob, the son of his heart if not his blood, Emma and Michael, the children they had created together, Nathaniel felt a profound gratitude for that fateful day by the Cimarron River. What had begun with heartbreak had blossomed into a life fuller and richer than he could have imagined. The note that had once broken his heart had, in the end, mended it in ways he never could have foreseen. And the baby left in a basket by the river had found not just a home, but a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come.